Let's go. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Comet Office Hours. We're kicking this year off strong. We've got a session going on for really a series of sessions going on for the next 8 weeks, starting today with a session where we're talking about how to translate business problems and machine learning problems and things like that. We've got a very special guest today. Is my good friend, who I'm going to introduce to you guys in just a second here. But hopefully you guys are excited as I am for this series. It's going to be great. If you got questions, feel free to leave your questions right here in the Zoom chat. If you're in the Zoom chat, I've also got my colleagues from Comet monitoring my LinkedIn stream. So if you guys got questions on LinkedIn, feel free to drop them right there into the comment section and we'll get to all of your questions. Without further ado, let me introduce our guest today. So our guest today is a curious and persistent product and marketing manager with a cross-functional background in business, energy, and data. He's helped launch new software products and analysis departments with the goal of increasing data literacy and helping people make better decisions. He's currently a senior product marketing manager at Anaconda, where he's bringing innovative data products to the market and serving as a steward of product, story, and voice of customer data. Please help me in welcoming my good friend, Christian Capdeville. Christian, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to join us on this office hour session today.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to be here. Really love what you're doing. Love the connection and edification you're bringing to the community, Harpreet. Thanks for having me.
No, it's absolutely my pleasure, Christian. So before we get into some questions on how we could think about business impact and defining business impact, talk to us a little bit about what your role at Anaconda is.
Yeah, product marketing is really interesting. And invariably, when you tell somebody that you're in product marketing, the question is, so what would you say you do here? What is that role anyway? And I think probably the most succinct way to put it is that you're owning positioning. And that means you're owning positioning of either a certain product or a suite of products, both within the company and outside of the company. So you're telling the story. And Harpreet, that should resonate with you. You're a great storyteller yourself. And so you want to tell the product story for your internal constituents so that everybody knows what you have, what you're building, what the future looks like. And you want to do the same for the customer. And the language is often different, but as the product marketing manager, you sit between that marketing and product team to accomplish that.
Thanks so much for sharing that. It's a really interesting kind of type of role, right? It just goes to show how broad data science really is and how many different roles and functions come together to make it possible to do data science, to bring value from machine learning to an organization. So I want to talk a bit about this document that you shared on LinkedIn a while ago. I'll make sure to drop a link in the chat as well. But it was all about defining KPIs and setting up, articulating business impact. And so I'd like to get into some questions I had from that document. And definitely if you guys in the audience have questions, go ahead and drop them into the chat or comment section. I'd love to hear from you on those points. But why is it that a lot of data science teams, a lot of machine learning teams aren't as effective as they could be when it comes to demonstrating the impact that data science or machine learning could have on a company's business outcomes?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And, my background originally as Harpreet wasn't just data science. And so I've transitioned to that in more recent times, but did spend quite a bit of time as the business stakeholder. So I have a lot to say about communicating business impact. And honestly, this is a problem that doesn't just apply to data science teams. Many teams and many organizations struggle with this. And a couple of reasons why I've seen is, one, we might get tunnel vision on our function or our technical details that we're dealing with. And that leads to a lack of alignment with kind of key business goals. We got to lift our heads up once in a while to make sure that what we're doing, the tasks, actually align with the business outcomes that are important. And three, a big one, sometimes we don't want to talk about because it's tricky, but a lack of relationships and communication with key organizational influencers. These kind of hubs of influence and knowledge, which if you can connect them, you can uncover a lot of insight for the organization. But if everybody's heads down and not really building relationships outside of their team, it becomes much more difficult. And you find yourself working in a silo and people not knowing what you're working on and maybe not caring once you deliver it.
So it does sound like a lot of the hurdles to success have less to do with technical skills and more to do with soft skills like communication and relationship building. Have you seen that to be the case in your experience?
Oh yeah, 100%. And I've seen this many times. Ultimately, it's easier to keep your head down and work on what you know. And you're really good at that. And you know all the technical stuff and you're reading the papers and you're a data wizard. The other side of that, people are messy. Relationship building is this esoteric thing. You can't really read a textbook on it necessarily, although there are a lot of good books recently that have come out on the subject to help us. But if you're not in the practice of regularly communicating with kind of a wide range of folks, then this can seem pretty daunting. Now, however, I'll say this, the people who do build relationships across the organization, and they're oftentimes a rare breed, these folks exponentially increase their own value to that organization. You become this critical conduit for information and insights, which can unlock real business value. But it's a soft skills thing, not really a technical thing for the most part, in my view.
So talk to us a little bit about, I guess, how can we develop those skills, not only the soft skills, but the skills of really understanding what it is the business wants to achieve? Because I feel as a machine learning practitioner myself, it's very hard to resist the temptation of just getting on the data and just like throwing algorithms at the thing without really connecting what it is I'm doing to what the business is trying to achieve. What are some steps we could take to help us make that connection so that it's not less of us just trying things and more of us purposely trying to get closer and closer to a desired outcome?
Yeah, and I think outcome is the right word. This is a problem that is not just in data science. I see it. It's a big issue in product as well. And so one book that I've recommended on the office hours, on the other office hours that we've been on with you, is the Continuous Discovery Habits by Teresa Torres. And she outlines this process by which you would map all these different opportunities to the product and business outcomes. And that way, you're sure everything you work on ties back to something that's high value. That's a really great way to orient our thinking, not just in product, but also in data science and in other areas. And what we'll find as we start mapping that is there's holes in our knowledge. We don't know what the most important business outcome is. We might not know how to really move that big rock, that big OKR that our department is working on. And that is your signal that it's time for you to communicate with other people outside of your team, or maybe at the senior leadership level. And sometimes we might think that we're going to bother these folks, or we're going to look dumb because we don't know. The only way to learn is to talk with them. And oftentimes, from my own experience and sitting in the seat as a business stakeholder, if somebody comes to me, they're in a technical role and they're asking questions at a higher level, that impresses me. I don't expect them to know it all. It impresses me that they have the curiosity and the wherewithal to come ask and learn that, and then incorporate that into the day-to-day of what they're doing. So you just gotta do the uncomfortable thing. When you identify those gaps in the knowledge, go talk to the people who can help you tie those tasks to the outcomes.
Yeah, a lot of it comes down straight just communication, being inquisitive and curious, and asking the right questions. One thing you mentioned in your response there, just to clarify for folks who might not be familiar with this framework, is this concept of OKRs. Can you share a little bit about that, and how have you used that to achieve success with some business outcomes?
Yeah, OKRs, objectives and key results, a lot of times, rather than thinking about annual planning, because in our line of work, a year is as good as a decade. It's way too long. I think about quarters and at the most. So every 3 months, hey, we want to accomplish these key things, and here's how we're going to know that we're winning. Here's how we're going to know we're doing it. Here's how we're going to know it's working. And you have these sometimes down to the position level. So maybe my job or your job has a certain list of OKRs that we want to hit, and that if we're given that by management, we hope that it's supportive of a larger business outcome. One thing that Anaconda does that I really is they don't use OKRs necessarily for individuals, but they have what they call, and I think others do this as well, they have the rocks, right? Like big rocks, which are big company rocks. And those kind of roll down to departmental rocks. And what I love about this is it removes the silos of individual people having OKRs on their own, and instead we're working together on one big goal, or maybe 2 or 3 goals for the department that roll up to a big company goal. And what I've found is that, at least in Anaconda, that lends itself to having really good alignment strategically. And if you're on a data science team, if everybody on that team has good alignment to what the company is trying to do from a big rock perspective, and what your department says is the big thing that you need to work towards, that's going to really help you get clarity on what things you should be working on and what things you might leave for later.
I like that concept of big rocks, and how that helps you drive towards clarity on what it is that you should be doing, because you can have a whole host of options in front of you, a whole menu of things that you could be working on. Could you share a framework with us for maybe prioritizing the right projects, or if it's easier to a framework for identifying the big rocks?
Yeah, this is the rub, right? Like at what point can you say that you're confident in that you have the right outcomes? If you go and read the kind of continuous discovery habits and you start trying to say, I'm going to build my own opportunity solution tree, which is the term she uses to link kind of the things you might work on to the big outcomes, you'll find that very quickly this thing grows to be huge. There's so many opportunities out there. And so you're like, well, which ones do I pick? And so it's really important for us to think in terms of the problems and opportunities first, rather than the solution. Hey, I know that I have the data to do this, and it would be really cool to do these three things with it. But if you're starting there, you're in the danger zone, and you need to like pump the brakes and back up and reorient your thinking to say, first, do I have a really good understanding of like what's painful for the business and what our big drivers are? So if I were to think about simplifying that into a framework, there's a few questions any framework's going to need to answer. You got to answer these things about the projects. Is it feasible? Is it valuable? Is it strategic? Is it supported within the organization? And is it urgent? And actually urgent, not just, hey, I need this ASAP. Is it urgent? Because ASAP really means never. You got to put a date on things, honestly. The more of those, so is it feasible, valuable, strategic, supported, and urgent? And the more of those boxes checked, generally the higher priority. And one way you can do this in practice is you want to start with the business problems that your data can solve, rather than starting with the methodology, as we mentioned. Next, you're going to want to maybe solicit feedback and input. You're going to have holes in your knowledge, right? So solicit that input from various teams and leaders, so that you can identify the most impactful opportunities rather than the most impactful projects, because we're still focusing on the opportunities or problems. And then, as mentioned in that document I shared, I think it's a great idea to run a proof of concept. Do something that you can accomplish in maybe a 6 to 12 week time period. It might not be the whole grand scheme, but it gives you the ability to break it down into smaller chunks and to deliver value quickly. And when you can start delivering real value, now you're going to have the support. If you find yourself constantly running into speed bumps and brick walls of not having buy-in, this is one of the reasons. If you show some results, even if they're small results, some results, 1% improvement on big business drivers, people are going to get excited. People are going to get behind you. And this kind of feeds into the last piece is, as part of that proof of concept, you want to be able to put something live and into production if possible, actually realize some benefit. And if you can do that, you're going to have a lot of support behind you from key folks. And putting that into practice also allows you to have a quicker iteration cycle. And Harpreet, as well as anybody, that the faster you can iterate, the better you're going to become a lot quicker.
That was so clear. I absolutely love that, Christian. Thank you so much. Definitely, I feel like there's a blog post to be written from that segment right there. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I think implicit in there is the importance of actually communicating progress and process with stakeholders. How do we get stakeholders involved? When do we get stakeholders involved? To what degree should they get involved? Do I need to be messaging them every time like I do an incremental improvement on my model output? Like, how should I be engaging the stakeholders? How do I figure out how I should be engaging the stakeholders?
Yeah, that's maybe a 1 or 2 sentence question with probably another blog post answer. But I could say the worst time to get them involved is after you've already done all the work, and you've probably wasted your time and theirs at that point. So you need to bring them in before you start. You need to talk to them while you're developing that proof of concept. Again, I see so many parallels between data science and product. Product has the same issue where if you go heads down for a year and build a product and never talk to your customers, you're not doing that continuous discovery, you're going to find that you built the wrong thing, almost guaranteed, right? And so you want to have the discussions ahead of time and do the discovery work before you start working. But then once you start building what you think they need, you also maybe weekly, right? Probably know if you're doing a 6 to 12 week POC, yeah, at least once a week, you need to be getting feedback from some key stakeholders that can tell you when you're on the wrong track. Something I thought of just now when you asked that question is, you've heard this idea that airplanes are like constantly off course throughout most of their flights, right? And so the pilots are always having to make these slight course corrections to make sure they get to the right place and not 500 miles off in the wrong direction. And the projects are like this. Like, we got to always be making these small course corrections. And for that, we need to have the consistent input from the stakeholders. So if you want a rule of thumb, every week be talking to them. And not every time, and not 5 times a day when you're making a 2% improvement on your R squared value or something like that, but about the key stuff. And when you're talking about this, I also think it's important to note, we don't want to just be an order taker. Like, oftentimes people seem to be asking for one thing, but really they need or want something else. You might not know how to verbalize it, or you might not be aligned. You might be misunderstanding. We can uncover this by putting as much effort into understanding our stakeholders and executives as we do into understanding our data. I think the data scientists, we really understand the value of the exploration phase, and you got to know the data. You got to know the stakeholders that are telling you to do stuff with the data also. So if you take that same kind of diligence and apply it to people, you'll probably be on the right track. And I just say you remember that it's our job to translate between those people and the data. So it means tailoring our communication to these folks. And there's no easy silver bullet for that. All I can say is, again, iterate, talk to them often, have the mentality that you want to carry their banner, because they probably are the closest to the big business drivers. And their banner is probably going to be good for the organization. If you don't know yourself yet, then trust that and be on their team. And when they see that you're on their team, they're going to be excited about what you're doing.
Speaking of, there's a slide in that document that you shared. There's a link right here in the Zoom chat to that document. Also, I'll share the link on the LinkedIn comments as well to the document you distributed about defining business impact. But one thing was knowing your audience, which I think you're hinting towards at the end of the response there. How do we know our audience? How do we figure out who our audience is? How do we figure out how to communicate with them? So I think up to this point, we've established like the cadence and the depth of involvement. But I guess, yeah, how do we know who our audience is, and how do we know how to communicate with them?
I think there's a danger when we start thinking about people and relationships, because of how messy it can seem, is that we might overcomplicate this. But really, ultimately, people do things for a few key reasons. If you excuse the crudeness, but they want to get paid or laid, as the saying goes, right? Now, hopefully in business, we're dealing with the first two primarily. So figure out how they're paid, figure out how they can become made, and you'll probably have a pretty good idea of what's going to resonate with them. And if the incentives in your organization are set up the right way, they are made and they are paid based on things that are good for the overall business. So driving the big revenue drivers, reducing the big cost centers. When you're talking to these folks, to make it really concrete, ask them explicitly what their goals are. What decisions are they trying to make? And importantly, in the case that you're talking about, how would they define success? What would it look like to win? And you have them explicitly, lay that out, and you can document that, and you can make sure afterwards by sending an email and say, hey, this is what it looked like when we were talking. This is the message I came away with. Is that right? Do that feedback loop, and I think you'll find that you'll very quickly get aligned, and you'll very quickly be able to figure out through a couple iterations of that what is important to them. It won't really change. Like the flavor may change, but the big incentives are probably going to stay pretty much the same.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I guess that's an interesting point, because everything you're talking about, right, those skills, you can't really be taught those skills, have to learn them. And I guess that's part of the reason why these job postings will say something along the lines of 2 to 3 years of experience. It's not 2 to 3 years of experience with the technical part. It's 2 to 3 years of experience dealing with people and defining problems and getting clarity and moving the needle forward on stuff. So we'll do one last question here before we open it up to some audience questions. I know we only got a few more minutes left here. I guess, how do we go about defining KPIs for our projects?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Now, first, as we alluded to earlier, you probably don't want to use your R-squared and other data-centric metrics when you're communicating or even setting KPIs along with your stakeholders. They don't really know or care about that kind of stuff. It goes back to what it is that incentivizes them. How are they made? How are they paid? How is the organization succeeding? So our projects really need to be benchmarked in terms that are meaningful to the business: revenue, cost, churn, that kind of stuff. And we as data professionals will know which model parameters and which outputs signify those things. But it's our job to translate that when we're talking about KPIs so that we can have mutual buy-in. We say, hey, we're going to look to decrease this primary cost center by 1%. We're going to do 0.5% revenue increase on this top 3 revenue item. And we might think those small percentages are not a big deal, but when you're talking about these big companies, that's a huge deal. You can make a 0.5% revenue increase and things like that. And those are the terms we need to talk about it with. So it needs to happen in partnership with stakeholders. And again, goes back to that question of what would success look like for you? Are we just trying to beat baseline? Do we have a budget that we really have to be able to come in under when we're talking about cost centers? Do we have an ambitious growth goal that we have to hit? So baseline is not good enough. We got to double revenue or something like this. Though we got to speak that business language, entrench the KPIs in that, and make sure your stakeholders are involved in setting those KPIs, because oftentimes we're not going to know what those best ones are on our own.
Christian, thank you so much for sharing that. And something I'd like to share with the audience and everyone listening here. There's actually a couple of blog posts that our good friend Vin Vashista had written about using KPIs to get buy-in for more advanced data science projects. And another blog post he wrote that was AI strategy KPI library. I want to share those with you folks here. They'll be in the notes for the show as well. I didn't get a chance to digest and present these for you guys, but they are here in the chat and they'll be in the comments of LinkedIn for you guys to check out. Definitely great articles as well by Vin Vijayista there. Let's open it up to questions. Let's take some questions from the audience here. Anyone on Zoom, if you guys would like to ask a question, feel free to unmute yourself, ask the question, turn on your camera if you'd like, or simply raise your hand or type out your question. I'd love to hear from you guys. I see one question actually coming in from LinkedIn from Suda, and she's knowing, can we get to know the popular technology and information technology using data science? It's a good question. I'm not sure I have an answer for that. Any thoughts on that, Christian?
If you want to get the pulse of what's happening in data science, this is actually one of the reasons why Anaconda, we recently launched our forums. So we have a whole kind of nucleus, we call nucleus community, and they're actually this thing that I've shared, the 7 or 8 page document that I shared on business impact came from the nucleus repository. So we have all kinds of white papers, we've got tutorials, things like that. But more importantly, when you start talking about community, which is really where the wisdom of the crowds comes from, you want to find yourself, or get yourself over to the forums there, also Reddit. Of course, if you're asking questions on Stack Overflow, any sort of community is where you're going to see where the community as a whole is going, what tools are the most popular, what questions are on the top of people's minds. And a question like that, if you have a specific question on a specific technology, or you just want to know, hey, what are the first things I should be looking at? Everything from beginners to experts are there right now on the Nucleus forums. And Anaconda, I think, is in a great position to do that with 25 to 30 million users. And it's the first stop for a lot of data practitioners. So plug yourself into community, and that's the best way to find out, because one person will tell you, I could give you my thoughts, my answers, but they're not going to be nearly as good as what the community overall will be able to share with you.
That's a very excellent point, plugging into communities and staying up to date and in touch with kind of the pulse beat of what's happening. Again, if anybody has questions for Christian on what we've discovered or what we discussed, please let me know before we jump into a quick presentation that kind of builds on what we're chatting with Christian. We've got him for just another few more minutes. I know you probably got a busy day ahead of you, man, so I appreciate you taking time to be here.
Yeah, this was great. I appreciate the invite, Harpreet. I had to do it again sometime.
Oh, absolutely, man. Anytime. So we've got a question here from LinkedIn. One of the problems focusing too much on OKRs and KPIs is that they may lead to unintended consequences, something called Greshams Law. How do we keep that balance within the data science and analytics field so we can use KPIs appropriately in their intended manner?
Yep, and this is another great question because it's not just confined to the data science world, right? A lot of teams deal with this kind of challenge. But maybe a good example of this is pretty much every department ever is spending a bunch of money at the end of the year because they have a budget to spend. They're incentivized to do that. And if they don't spend it all, they're going to get their budget reduced. So there we've created an incentive that encourages wastefulness. KPIs can do the same thing, where we will encourage incentives for teams or for individuals to do things that aren't really in the best interest of the overall organization, which is why I think I really like the idea of the big rock. You have a departmental set of goals that you're going after. And if everybody can look at those 3 or 4 goals and say, yes, we're going to do that, that's what we're incentivizing everybody to do. You're going to have less of these silos where people feel like they have to hit their own individual goals at the expense of the rest of the company. So one way to mitigate that is to do the big rock thing. There's probably ways to mitigate it within the KPI structure as well. You just got to be really diligent and remember that everything's about incentives. And you just got to ask yourself, if I'm a logical person and I'm incentivized by this set of KPIs, what am I going to do? And don't just set it and forget it. You got to make sure you're coming back and revisiting it and that it's working as intended.
Thanks so much, Christian. Another question coming in from LinkedIn from my good friend, George Faircan. How do you ensure you're getting down to the root cause of the business problem?
For me, I know talking with the stakeholders and everything is great, but I always wanted to see like the numbers themselves. I wanted to get down into the finance quarterly, monthly books and see, okay, how big is the magnitude? Not only that this is my key revenue driver, but what's the order of magnitude that this is bigger, or that this is my greatest cost, and how distant are second and third place compared to that cost, so that I know if I can make a 1% improvement here, it actually moves the needle. We can't always, sometimes finance has walls around those things, so we can't always get access to that stuff. But I would say get down to as much, if you're like me, get down to as much granular detail as you can, to get the proof that you need to get fired up about going after that big cost center or that big revenue driver. And not that it's just qualitatively somebody saying, yeah, this is a big deal. I always really wanted to see the numbers and understand the math myself.
Christian, there's a couple of questions coming in on LinkedIn. Do you have a few more minutes to answer a couple of questions? Awesome. Another question coming here from Raj Johan is, this is a good one. How do you see the importance of agility in data science projects?
Agility maybe meaning something like the Eric Rice lean startup idea of pivoting and things like this, perhaps, I'm assuming. So I think that goes back to our idea about course correcting, like we're on our flight. It's critically important because if you're off by 1 degree, then by the time you get to the end of your flight, you're 500 miles off course. We have to be able to have that feedback loop. And agility is a nice word, but I immediately translated it because I think it's the agile, right? It's a buzzword almost. It means, in my mind, to be able to pivot when you need to, and to be able to do it often, and to be able to do it quickly. And we're smart as we might be, we're not geniuses, we're not clairvoyant, we're not going to know it on our own. And this is where that constant kind of communication, this is maybe a little bit of a tangent, but my boys started playing competitive volleyball last year. And what really struck me about this, you got 6 guys on one side of the court, and the team that doesn't talk loses. They're always talking, they're always communicating, they're all right. And on data science teams and any other teams, that's critical. You're not going to win without communicating, not only within your team, but outside of it also. That's what will feed into the agility for you to be able to pivot. And it's also why you don't want to get married to solutions. It's why we want to think about problems. Because if you got a pet solution, you're not going to pivot off that solution. You never will. You got to think about opportunities so that you can say, hey, this solution actually wasn't the best, but there's 2 or 3 other ways we might be able to do this. So focusing on the problem, getting the feedback that allows you to pivot, that's key. And you're going to have to do that, I think, in my mind, to be able to succeed with those projects.
Thank you very much for that, Christian. And Raj, we actually did a roundtable discussion just a few weeks ago with team leads from Uber, WorkFusion, and The Real. And something we discussed in that session was development practices for data science. We talked about agile frameworks and things like that. We will go ahead and drop a couple of links to those YouTube videos for you right there on LinkedIn, so you can just get right to the parts that you need. And if you want to watch the whole video after that, you'll be able to do that. But we'll get those links for you right there, Raj. Sit tight. Another question coming in from George Faircan. Great friend, George Faircan. Love that guy. So do you have a preference for data science project methodologies? CRISP DM, RDSP, etc.
For me, so maybe to give you the preference, I'm probably out of my depth to answer that question. I myself am not a data science practitioner, at least as of yet. I work with them and I have worked with them, but I'm more on the product marketing side. So maybe Harpreet, I'll let you answer that if you have any knowledge in that realm.
Yeah, I have a simplified framework, and it's just I call it PEEP, PEEP: plan, explore, exploit, and present. Or sorry, plan, explore, experiment, and present. It's just like just an iterative framework. I think with data science, it's iterative, machine learning iterative by nature. So you just have to have flexibility in whatever process you're doing, just to be able to move quickly, right? Because you don't want to spend too much time. You don't want to spend 3 weeks tuning hyperparameters, right? If it's not moving the needle that much. So that would be my answer to that. Just pick a framework that's flexible, that allows you to move fast, that allows you to gain insight quickly. Another good one is, I learned this one from David Spiegelhalter's book, The Art of Statistics. It's PDAC. PPDAC, what's that stand for again? There's plan, prepare, do analysis. I'm butchering it right now. So just look that up, PPDAC life cycle, and I think that might have the answer that you're looking for there, George. Christian, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to join us. Everybody else, sit tight. We still got a bit of a presentation to go. We're going to talk about more actionable steps on how to translate business problems to machine learning problems. But Christian, thank you for being here.
It was great, Harpreet. Thanks. Really appreciate it, man. Looking forward to the rest of this.
Absolutely. My pleasure. So let's go ahead and go to this presentation here. All right. So 7 simple steps to a more standardized machine learning process. So over the span of the next several weeks, we are going to cover these steps through a combination of blog posts, lecture sessions, panel discussions, and interviews with leaders and practitioners in the field. You're going to have an opportunity to hear from senior and principal data scientists who have been in the game working on huge projects, and also some thought leadership and lessons from yours truly. So we'll briefly touch on each of these steps in a little more detail in just a few slides here, but the 7 steps are simply this right here. So just define and document the scope and success criteria for your project, which we talked with Christian about, and we'll go into more depth in just a few minutes here. You want to establish dumb baselines. You want to understand and validate your data. You want to do data processing and feature engineering, iterate over different algorithms, hyperparameter search, and fine-tuning your model, and then finally surfing. So you're going to learn about these 7 steps in greater detail through a series of blog posts that will be published on our in-house publication called Heartbeat. If you're not already familiar with Heartbeat, please do check it out. There's going to be a link right there in the chat for this, and also on LinkedIn. Go ahead and subscribe to that publication. We've got a bunch of great content out there. It's hosted through Medium. All of our publications are open, though anybody can view them, and they're always unlocked. You can check that out. So heartbeat.comet.ml. So be sure to read each blog post before the corresponding session so that you can ask any questions you'd like by submitting it to a Google form that you'll also have in your email. It's going to be an amazing series. I hope you're excited as I am. So if you haven't already registered for the session, we'll go ahead and share the registration link on LinkedIn for you as well. When you register, you'll be put part of our email sequence so that every Sunday or Monday before the Wednesday event, you'll have enough time to review the reading material, the supplementary material, and then also a link to the Google form sheet where you can ask questions. So now to piggyback on the discussion that we just had with Christian, let's think about how to translate a business problem to a machine learning problem. So there's a few things that we're going to have to talk about, right? There's really 8 steps that we need to go through in order to translate a business problem to a machine learning problem. First and foremost is it's creating a project charter. And what this is just a formal, typically short document that describes your project in its entirety, including what the objectives are, how it's going to be carried out, who the stakeholders are. It's a crucial ingredient to planning the project because you're going to use this throughout the project lifecycle. Next, after you've got the project charter, you want to clearly define your problem statement. So starting with the business problem or question is how the team keeps itself connected to the business. So this means the team is working on business relevant projects, which opens the question, how does the business evaluate progress and improvement? So you can't achieve any success unless you identify and clarify the problem that you need to solve, define the desired business outcome, and determine some objective way to measure progress against that outcome. But how do you do that? So in the business context, this is typically some statement regarding an increase in revenue or a decrease in costs. And here's an example script that you can use to help start the conversation. We want to implement, test, research, determine something so that we can increase, decrease, or otherwise affect in some quantitatively measurable way some outcome. So notice the key elements to this. We're clarifying the problem statement or the research question or the hypothesis, right? So for example, we want to implement a recommender system into our point of sales software, right? Then we want to identify and gain agreement on the desired outcome. So ask what it is that we want to achieve by solving this problem. So it needs to be specific, measurable, objective business outcome. We can say that we want to see a X percentage increase in revenue from everyone who is given a recommendation from our recommendation system versus everyone else who didn't receive a recommendation, right? So then we can determine an objective measure of progress against that desired outcome. So how will we measure the outcome? What will make this a successful project? So for example, we want to increase sales by X percent by recommending additional add-on items at the point of sale. Okay, so this is the outcome that we want to achieve, and we can track it, right? We can objectively look at all the people who recommended something at the point of sale and all the people who are not recommended something at the point of sale and see, is there a difference, right? KPIs is the next thing, right? So it's the third thing here. So identifying a KPI that tracks the business outcome involves defining, leading, and lagging indicators, which inform whether we are affecting our desired business outcome or not. So lagging indicators are just descriptive statistics that tell you how you did in the past. They don't really give an indication of what's going to happen in the future. So their main utility is in describing the past and explaining the past, and that's really it. Leading indicators present a predictive understanding of the future. So they're better than lagging metrics because you still have the time and ability to act on them. So whatever combination of lagging or leading indicators you choose, they need to be defined as specific metrics. So measures, numbers, quantities that are clear and specific with a well-defined way to measure and calculate them. So ultimately, we need to decide whether the thing we're tracking helps us make better decisions in a timely manner. So a good KPI, a good characteristic of a KPI rather, is that it's actionable, right? Adjusting our goals and how we define our key metrics and indicators is acceptable, but we need to be honest with ourselves, right? We need to recognize the change this means for our organization and not just lower our expectations so that we can keep going on despite what our evidence is suggesting. So quoting my good friend Vin Vicious here, model-driven KPIs are used for decision support and advanced automation. The goal is to improve business outcomes by allowing decision makers to understand and predict the impact of their decision on a business outcome. And when models meet high reliability requirements, some strategic decisions are automated. Pricing, marketing, and logistics are early use cases for most businesses. Next, we want to think about activation levers, right? So identifying activation levers at your disposal involves thinking of everything you can to affect the problem at all. So here are the types of questions that you should be asking yourself when it comes to identifying an activation lever. How do we get there? How do we get to our desired result? What can we actually do to affect the outcome in any meaningful way? So what actions can we take that could reasonably be implemented and have an impact on a leading KPI, right? You have to actually be able to do something. And then what can the business do to affect that outcome? Because the business is operating under some constraints, right? So what can the business actually do to impact that activation lever? And then once the activation lever is identified, you need to determine which ones you can reasonably automate and then have some action be deployed. Then going on to part 5 here, we're talking about data sources. So once we identify which activation levers we want to pull, we need to determine if we have enough data to allow us to build a model that will actually be able to help us make a reasonable decision with it. This is where we can determine if we are even capable of pulling the levers that are going to impact the leading KPI and ultimately make progress against our outcome. So do we actually have the data that we need to help us optimize our lever pulls? So we need to either have the data or the capability to get it. So without data, we're not going to be able to know what lever to pull at what time, in what way. If we don't have the right data and we can't get the right data, then we can't optimize that lever pull to change the leading KPI to get the outcome that we want. If we can't find a new lever, then we need to find a new KPI. So essentially, a new strategy to solve the problem. And it's possible that we go back to the very start and conclude that we can't use data science for this particular problem statement or achieve this particular business outcome. That's a perfectly reasonable finding, right? So if we don't have the data to optimize the lever pull, then we need to go back and find a new lever to pull. Once you've got all that thought about, then you can think about the model, right? So if we get into the model stage, you should be able to answer the following questions. What's the problem that we're trying to solve? How are we measuring it? How are we optimizing it? How are we changing it? What data is required? It's not until we have these fundamental questions answered that we can reasonably begin to think about how we're going to model, capture, test, or otherwise implement our solution. So once we've identified all of the above answers to those questions in the form of a model with a reasonable metric to track model performance, right? That's what we're going to be able to have once we answer those questions. So then we can build a model that will use the data to pull the activation lever, which should then affect the KPI that you're tracking, which will inform you if you're on track to reaching your business objective. Next here, we're going to talk about metrics. So the KPI is tied to the business outcome, and the model metric is tied to the KPI. So you will be able to measure the outcome of a model and tie any improvement above baseline to our intervention through the KPI. So once the model has been tuned, we're in the implementation stage here, it needs to be deployed and automated so that our stakeholders can make decisions with the tools that we've built for them. You can then productionalize the model and collect data post-production so that you can identify whether your model is degrading, whether your data is drifting. If you're changing reality, you should expect data to drift. And at this point, you can start to use more data to fine-tune the model and see if you can optimize your cost function by maybe learning a better model. And once you've translated the problem, then you can start standardizing the process. So how do we standardize the process? So up until this point, we've just talked about how to translate the business problem into a machine learning problem, but we need to make sure that we're standardizing our process. So here's a roadmap to standardizing the experiment process. So we just talked about translating. Now let's talk about defining scope and success criteria. So this is the most crucial step in the process. Before writing any code or looking at any data, you need to be able to clearly state and quantify the scope of success for your project. Next here, we're going to think about baselines, right? So once you have your task and evaluation metrics defined, it might be tempting to hit the ground running and start trying different models on the data, but without establishing baselines, you don't know where you're headed, right? This is the key to figuring out whether you have a good model or not. Understanding and validating data and understanding and validating data, it's just during this phase of the process, it's important just to familiarize yourself with the data. Spend the time to scan through individual examples by hand if you need to identify outliers, find corrupted samples, look for other irregularities that might not be easily detectable through statistical tests. Then data processing and feature engineering. Based on the information gathered in this step, you're going to be now ready to prepare your data for the model. So model performance is tightly coupled to the data and our selection of pre-processing steps. This is going to have a huge impact on the final results. So there might be numerous transformations that are beneficial to the model, some of which might be known beforehand, others might only reveal themselves after a few iterations. Then you could think about finding the right model. So machine learning development is iterative, and the results from later stages in the pipeline are informed by the decisions you make here and here, right? Finally, optimizing the model. So at this stage, you can have an idea of the types of models that are able to fit your data, the features that work best for each model type, and the effects of scaling the data, what that'll have on each model type. And once you do that, you can start tuning the hyperparameters. And then finally, it's all about serving. So the final step in experimentation involves deploying the model to the end user. So at this stage, you should already have an evaluation framework in place for assessing the model's performance. And you should already have run some baseline heuristic models through the framework to tell if you're building a model that's affecting the business outcome or not. So that's a high-level overview of standardizing the experiment. There's a lot more detail going to be happening over the next several weeks as we talk to more practitioners and release more and more blog posts. So your homework is to check your email. So if you haven't already registered for the series, be sure to click the registration link that'll be in the video description if you're watching this on YouTube, or in the comments and chat section if you're watching this live. It's going to be 8 weeks long. Each week, we're going to have a live session just like this, same time, same place. You can join in. It'll be a combination of lectures, panel discussions, and interviews. Every week before the session, you're going to receive a link to just a short blog post, no more than a 10-minute read, which will support the themes that we're going to discuss in the upcoming series. You're also going to receive links to other resources where you can see these principles in action, most of them at least. You can also submit questions from our panel discussions and interviews, for the panel discussions and interviews. So you'll find a link in the emails to do that. So again, if you're watching this after the live stream on YouTube, for example, we'll have all the resources linked for you in the description as well. So next week, We're going to talk about how to define scope and success criteria for your machine learning projects. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for that. I am super, super excited about that. So that's it for today's session. If you guys have any questions, please do let me know. I see a question here on the chat coming in from Poonam. Let's see. Poonam says, I'm trying to research and understand more on the important parameters and data points to consider for building analytic models for assessing future spend, potential, and economic status per customer. Can you suggest any good literature or reference authorities on this subject? So right off the top of my head, no, but go ahead and pose this question in our Slack community and I can get you some, help you find some resources. I've never done anything like this, but I'm sure with a few Google keyword searches, we'll be able to get you some documentation that'll be very helpful for you. Questions coming in here, comment rather, on LinkedIn from John. Not just do we have the data, but we need it correctly structured and in the correct frequency for the model. Absolutely correct. And I'm excited in a few weeks on the 26th of January. We're going to be talking about understanding, validating, versioning, engineering your data. So we'll have a panel discussion with folks from Pachyderm and Great Expectations that'll be joining us for this. So it'll be a great discussion. Any other questions? Please do let me know. The registration link, if you're already in the Zoom room, that means you've already registered. For those of you on LinkedIn, I will go ahead and share the registration link so that you can join us. That way you won't miss out on any of the resources that we'll be sharing. You'll have an opportunity to ask questions. And yeah, super scratchy. So I'm going to pause for a bit and see if questions are coming in. Does not look like we have any more questions related to anything that we're discussing. So if anybody else has questions, please do let me know. It could be related to anything, whether it was something that we're discussing or not. I'd be happy to take your questions. We do have a few more minutes left for you guys here. Again, just talking about the different themes. We're going to talk about translating. We just talked about translating business problems to machine learning problems. We'll talk about how to define scope and success criteria. We'll talk about how to tell if you built a good model or not. We'll share some tips for understanding, validating, processing, and engineering data. We'll talk about how experiment management makes it easier to build models faster. And the very, very last presentation is going to be a special one with some of my very, very smart and intelligent colleagues talking about the last mile of machine learning and reproducibility of machine learning. So I hope you're excited for that. After this series, starting in March, we are going to be doing more hands-on work. So everything that we're covering here over the next 8 weeks should give you a framework for working through machine learning problems. And after that, we're going to put all these things in action. So starting in March, mid-March, we're going to do a series on deep learning with structured data. So trying to show people in quote unquote legacy organizations how they can use deep learning on their tabular data. Believe it or not, you could do deep learning on data that's in a relational database. So we're going to talk about how to do that and how to optimize those models as well. So it'll be a fun series. That's one I'm super excited about. And then after that, we might do some series on natural language processing and computer vision and things like that. So be sure you attend. We've got a few free copies of this, free e-copies of this book to give away. And I think I've got 3 copies, e-copies, not physical copies, but 3 e-copies to give away. And depending on participation and attendance over the next 8 weeks, you can win a copy of this book right here, Deep Learning for Structured Data. We're also going to have the author of this book on the show as well. We're hoping to get some people in from the industry to talk about this heated debate of nets versus trees. So I think it's going to be a great series. So I'm excited for that as well. So it doesn't look like we have any more questions coming in. So we'll go ahead and wrap this up. But thanks guys so much for joining. If you haven't already, be sure to register for this series, because when you register, you're going to get the preparatory material. You'll have the bonus resources, and you also have an opportunity to ask questions through the Google Forms that we're submitting. So thank you guys so much for joining us today. I'm really happy that you guys took time to join us, and I'm looking forward to next week. Take care. Have a good rest of the week. Remember, my friends, you've got one life on this planet. Why not try to do something big? Cheers, everyone.